for the purposes of helping us close read some important passages in Aime Ce's Notebook of a Return to Native Land. Before we start, I want to remind us of the Gregson Davis chapter that you read and about Césaire's important encounter in Paris of a set of African and Caribbean intellectuals that gave him a newfound perspective on his identity, his black identity, as something that's diasporic and transnational. This perspective will be important when you examine the poem and what it's doing with space and geography. So in this interview that the Haitian writer René de Pest did with Césaire, says something very important. The interviewer says, "In this circle of Negroes in Paris, was there a consciousness of the importance of African culture?" Césaire says yes, as well as an awareness of the solidarity among blacks. We had come from different parts of the world. It was our first meeting. We were discovering ourselves. This was very important. Until that time, until my generation, the French and the English, but especially the French, had followed the politics of assimilation unrestrainedly. We didn't know what Africa was. Europeans despised everything about Africa. And in France, people spoke of a civilized world and barbarian world. So, as a framework for looking at this poem, we have to understand how Césaire is trying to go against this attitude towards black culture, towards Caribbean and African culture as somehow barbaric. And one of the key terms that emerges from the poem is the term negritude. So negritude actually becomes a neologism for the first time in this poem. Now, the word "neg" is at the time was used as a derogatory term. It is similar to the N-word here in the United States. It's more polite to say the word noir, black. Indeed, you remember that from the Gregson Davis chapter that one of the first publications that Césaire makes, a very important magazine, was L'Étudiant Noir, the black student. Now, one of the issues that people have with negritude, right, this idea, the celebration of blackness, one of the problems that many intellectuals see is that this can lead to an essentialist way of thinking. That is, that blackness has a kind of essence, and that perhaps focusing on this essence might limit the capacity of different forms of being human. But I argue that Césaire's conception of negritude in Notebook Return to Native Land is different, right? It's not biologically essentialist at all. In fact, I think the way negritude or blackness is being conceived is as a historical phenomena, as a phenomena that can change over time. In an interview, Césaire states that there's no predetermined negritude. There is no essence. There's only history, a living history. So when we talk about this poem, I really want to focus on how blackness is being conceived in a poetic sense that's not strictly essentialist, but is a creative engagement with black history. Now, it's important to look at specific passages. So I want to start with negritude as conceptualized as an active engagement with the world. Right? a kind of force or presence that goes towards the world and seeks to transform it. So one of the first conceptions we have is in stanza 30. This is part of the second movement. I'll explain the different movements in a bit. But it says, "And on the way I will say to myself, and above all, my body as well as my soul, beware of assuming the sterile attitude of a spectator. For life is not a spectacle. A sea of miseries is not a proscenium." Proscenium means a stage. "A man screaming is not a dancing bear. And behold, here I come home." So this stanza 30 is important. It'll be important, especially the last week, where we'll see the Cuban director reference these lines when talking about spectatorship, right? So for Césaire, he wants to avoid being a spectator of reality, right? He wants to conceptualize his existence as an active engagement in issues of social justice, right? And so stanza 64 and 65 really demonstrates negritude as this active force. In fact, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre admired these lines in the essay Black Orpheus. So stanza 64 says, "My negritude is not a stone, its deafness hurled against the clamor of the day. My negritude is not a leucoma of dead liquid over the earth's dead eye. My negritude is neither tower nor cathedral. It takes root in the red flesh of the soil. It takes root in the ardent flesh of the sky. It breaks through opaque prostration with its upright patience." So we learn a lot about negritude by seeing what it's not, right? It's not a stone, right? It's not a dead liquid. It's not a tower nor a cathedral. So if it's not that, if it's something that takes root in the red flesh of the soil, what is Césaire actually saying about negritude? Why is taking root in the red flesh of the soil important? Now I want to stop here and talk a little bit about ways of interpreting poems. And as a rule, you want to see how parts of the poem connects to other parts of the poem. So when Césaire talks about the red flesh of the soil, we have to think about how the poem has articulated ideas about the earth, ideas about the land, ideas about the soil, and how this particular part of the text connects to that, connects to a broader discourse about nature in connection with negritude. Now, I don't want to, give away, not that I know the answer about what negritude is about, but I want to leave it open to you to think about what's going on in these articulations. So let's talk about the structure of the poem and get a sense of the big picture. I mentioned in the last video that as a whole, the poem begins with an intense sense of alienation, an alienation from the land, and ends with an affirmation of the subject's history and identity. So generally, scholars see the poem as having three movements. First, the first movement from page 3 to 11 describes Martinique in this alienating way. The middle movement happens when the poet goes away perhaps goes away to Europe, and it's not clear um, where he doesn't actually go to a specific place. It's almost as if he's journeying in his mind through different parts of the world. So not just Europe, but also the Caribbean. He mentions Haiti and the death of Toussaint Louverture, one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution at one point. But he also journeys imaginatively to Africa. So we could see that second part of the poem as a poet trying to configure his sense of space, to return to his native land, to return to Martinique with a new found sense of place. And so the final movement describes what he calls a strange pride that suddenly illuminates him. And the sense you get is a sense of acceptance. He finally accepts his black identity. So we had to figure out what does it mean that he accepts, right? How do we articulate this acceptance, right? Because it's not obvious, right? And finally, the very last parts of the text shows the poet destroying a slave ship and having this moment where he's lifted up into the stars and escapes what he calls the great black hole where he wanted to drown himself. So here's an example of the first movement. The first movement being where there's a sense of alienation in terms of his homeland of Martinique. So this stanza says, "In this inert town, the strange throng that does not huddle, does not mix, clever at discovering the point of disencasement, of flight, of dodging. This throng that does not know how to throng, this throng, one realizes, so perfectly alone under the sun, like a woman, one thought completely occupied with the lyric cadence of her buttocks, who abruptly challenges a hypothetical rain and enjoys it not to fall, or like a rapid sign of the cross without perceptible motive, or like the sudden grave animality of a peasant, urinating standing, her legs parted, stiff." So here, right, the word throng in French is foule. It's like a kind of mass or crowd. You get a sense that the people of Martinique don't yet know how to be a people, right? They don't have a strong sense of identity, so they're not an active group of people. They almost seem like a mass, right? That the poet is alienated from. Also, you have a representation of gender difference, right? You have the image of a woman, and we have to consider this is an approach that many students like to take. How does the poem represent women? How does a poem represent sexual difference? How does this part of the poem might connect with other representations of women throughout the poem? And here it seems quite negative, right? So the woman is occupied with the lyric cadence of her buttocks, and you have the animality of a peasant, a woman who's urinating standing. So I guess we have to be suspicious of what's going on here. Is this a way of affirming his masculinity, right? Is masculinity a part of this poem? So just something to watch out for. And so in the second movement, as I mentioned, there are these series of imaginative traveling throughout the world. So he goes to Europe, and And on stanza 39, he's leaving Europe, right? Leaving Europe utterly twisted with screams, silent currents of despair. Leaving the timid Europe, which collects and proudly overrates itself. I summon this beautiful egotism that ventures forth, and my plowing reminds me of an implacable cutwater. Wow. The image of plowing is interesting at the end there, and it connects with the word cutwater, which if you look it up, and you'll have to look up a lot of these words. Cutwater is the sort of the wake that is made from a ship. So it's almost as if he's imagining himself as a kind of ship that's traveling the ocean. But with the word plowing, right? Plowing, you plow a field to plant new seeds, to grow things. So it's a lot of interesting things going on here in terms of metaphor. And the next stanza talks about this idea of having blood in the memory, right? Of engaging the trauma of history, right? So much blood in my memory. In my memory are lagoons. They're covered with death's heads. They're not covered with water lilies. In my memory are lagoons. No woman's loincloth spread out on their shores. My memory is encircled with blood. My memory has a belt of corpses. So in the second movement, you're going to see this a lot. You're going to see moments of deep elation, moments where the speaker feels like has this joyous sense of enthusiasm. But then you see that he's brought down. His flight, his sense of transcendence is brought down by these moments where he remembers his past. So, broadly put, this poem is about engaging with history, transcending or transforming history. So, also notice again, there's gender differences being evoked with the woman's loincloths. We'll just have to track those images. And so there's a turning point in the second movement of the text. And this is a moment where the poet, maybe he's in Paris, maybe he's in Martinique, but the speaker encounters a black man on a streetcar and finds him to be ugly, right? It's the poem suggests that this man is a working class man. Maybe he's doesn't look too good because he's been working all day, but the speaker catches himself having these sort of racist thoughts about a black man, and so this is a low point for him. This is sort of the dark night of the soul. It says, "Me, I turned my eyes, proclaiming that I had nothing in common with this monkey. He was comical and ugly for sure. I displayed a big, complicitous smile. My cowardice rediscovered. Hail to the 3 centuries that uphold my civil rights and my minimized blood. My heroism, what a farce. This town fits me to a T. And my soul is prostrate like this town in its refuse and mud. This town, my face of mud." Now, if you're a really careful reader, you'll notice that the reference to the town being of refuse and mud echoes the way Martinique's described in the beginning of the poem with this reference to mud imagery. This is a sign of a good reader, right? Someone that could understand and feel the echoes in a text. Also, there's religious imagery here, right? his soul is prostrate, right? Almost as a kind of confession. The text as a whole has this spiritual religious structure. This is an angle of the poem that I would like some students to notice and to talk about on Friday and on Saturday. And so here's an example of the third movement where he finally gains a sense of acceptance. It says, I say, hooray! The old negritude progressively cadavers itself. The horizon breaks, recoils, and expands, and through the shredding of clouds, the flashing of a sign. The slave ship cracks from one end to the other. Its belly convulses and resounds. The ghastly tapeworm of its cargo gnaws the fetid guts, the strange suckling of the sea. Oh, one of my favorite parts of the poem. Right, so the word negritude is used here again, but it's an old negritude. It's an old kind of blackness that is cadavering itself, that's dying away. And you have this image of the speaker's horizon breaking and expanding. But you also have this image of a flashing of a sign, and this indicates the importance of language in the poem, the importance of the poet or speaker discovering his voice, discovering his use of language in a way that that's liberatory, a use of language that, in here, metaphorically cracks the slave ship. The other important aspect of the poem is geography. In stanza 19, you should look at that. Stanza 19 has one of the most famous descriptions of the Caribbean as a region. But in stanza 88, there's a very important articulation. He says, in my special geography too, the world map made for my own use, not tinted with the arbitrary colors of scholars, but with the geometry of my spilled blood. So what does geometry of my spilled blood mean? How is the world map made for his own use? Right? Remember, this is almost at the end of the poem. We're reaching the very end of the poem. And how did he create this geography? How did he construct this? What's the implicit hidden structure of the poem? And when you see the word blood, we have to consider how blood has been used throughout the poem. So, interesting enough, if we go back to stanza 40 talks about how there's blood in his memory, that his memory is encircled with blood. This seems to bring the poet down. But at the end here, this blood seems to be what's used to color his map of the world. So the poem makes a lot of interesting connections, and the purpose of discussion is for you to develop an angle of approach, right? You want to develop an angle of approach that focuses specifically on certain connections that you've made, that you feel is important, that you feel that your fellow students might overlook. So when you write your discussion forum, I want you to draw attention to the implicit connections that the poem makes, because it's in the implicit connections where you'll find a really powerful way of writing about the text. So that is all. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope this helps you get started on reading, uh, one of the most important texts in world literature.